Section 15 of The Life of Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Casper. The Life of Abraham Lincoln by Ward Hill Lamon. Chapter 11, Part 2. The first of these papers from Mr. Lincoln's pen is a letter of advice and consolation for his friend, for whom he apprehends the terrible things through which, by the help of that friend, he has himself just passed. My dear Speed, feeling, as you know I do, the deepest solicitude for the success of the enterprise you are engaged in, I adopt this as the last method I can invent to aid you in case, which God forbid, you shall need any aid. I do not place what I am going to say on paper, because I can say it better in that way than I could by word of mouth. But were I to say it orally before we part, most likely you would forget it at the very time when it might do you some good. As I think it reasonable that you will feel very badly some time between this and the final consummation of your purpose, it is intended that you shall read this just at such a time. Why I say it is reasonable that you will feel very badly yet is because of three special causes added to the general one which I shall mention. The general cause is that you are naturally of a nervous temperament, and this I say from what I have seen of you personally, and what you have told me concerning your mother at various times, and concerning your brother William at the time his wife died. The first special cause is your exposure to bad weather on your journey, which my experience clearly proves to be very severe on defective nerves. The second is the absence of all business and conversation of friends, which might divert your mind, give it occasional rest from the intensity of thought which will sometimes wear the sweetest idea threadbare and turn it to the bitterness of death. The third is the rapid and near approach of that crisis on which all your thoughts and feelings concentrate. If from all these causes you shall escape and go through triumphantly, without another twinge of the soul, I shall be most happily but most egregiously deceived. If, on the contrary, you shall, as I expect you will at some time, be agonized and distressed, let me, who have some reason to speak with judgment on such a subject, beseech you to ascribe it to the causes I have mentioned, and not to some false and ruinous suggestion of the devil. But, you will say, do not your causes apply to every one engaged in a like undertaking? By no means. The particular causes, to a greater or less extent, perhaps do apply in all cases, but the general one, nervous debility, which is the key and conductor of all the particular ones, and without which they would be utterly harmless, though it does pertain to you, does not pertain to 1 in 1,000. It is out of this that the painful difference between you and the mass of the world springs. I know what the painful point with you is at all times when you are unhappy. It is an apprehension that you do not love her as you should. What nonsense! How came you to court her? Was it because you thought she deserved it, and that you had given her reason to expect it? If it was for that, why did not the same reason make you court Ann Todd and at least 20 others of whom you can think, and to whom it would apply with greater force than to her? Did you court her for her wealth? Why, you know she had none. But you say you reasoned yourself into it. What do you mean by that? Was it not that you found yourself unable to reason yourself out of it? Did you not think, and partly form the purpose, of courting her the first time you ever saw her or heard of her? What had reason to do with it at that early stage? There was nothing at that time for reason to work upon. Whether she was moral, amiable, sensible, or even of good character, you did not, nor could not then know, except perhaps you might infer the last from the company you found her in. All you then did or could know of her was her personal appearance and deportment, and these, if they impress at all, impress the heart and not the head. Say candidly, Were not those heavenly black eyes the whole basis of all your early reasoning on the subject? After you and I had once been at the residence, did you not go and take me all the way to Lexington and back for no other purpose but to get to see her again on our return that evening to take a trip for that express object? What earthly consideration would you take to find her scouting and despising you and giving herself up to another? But of this you can have no apprehension, and therefore you cannot bring it home to your feelings. I shall be so anxious about you that I shall want you to write by every mail. Your friend, Lincoln. Springfield, Illinois, February 3, 1842. Dear Speed, your letter of the 25th January came to hand to-day. You well know that I do not feel my own sorrows much more keenly than I do yours, when I know of them, and yet I assure you I was not much hurt by what you wrote me of your excessively bad feeling at the time you wrote. Not that I am less capable of sympathizing with you now than ever, not that I am less your friend than ever, but because I hope and believe that your present anxiety and distress about her health and her life must and will forever banish those horrid doubts which I know you sometimes felt as to the truth of your affection for her. If they can once and forever be removed, and I almost feel a presentiment that the Almighty has sent your present affliction expressly for that object, surely nothing can come in their stead to fill their immeasurable measure of misery. The death scenes of those we love are surely painful enough, but these we are prepared for and expect to see. They happen to all, and all know they must happen. Painful as they are not an unlooked-for sorrow. Should she, as you fear, be destined to an early grave, it is indeed a great consolation to know that she is so well prepared to meet it. Her religion, which you once disliked so much, I will venture you now prize most highly. But I hope your melancholy forebodings as to her early death are not well founded. I even hope that ere this reaches you she will have returned with improved and still improving health, and that you will have met her and forgotten the sorrows of the past in the enjoyment of the present. I would say more if I could, but it seems that I have said enough. It really appears to me that you yourself ought to rejoice and not sorrow at this indubitable evidence of your undying affection for her. Why, Speed, if you did not love her, although you might not wish her death, you would most certainly be resigned to it. Perhaps this point is no longer a question with you, and my pertinacious dwelling upon it is a rude intrusion upon your feelings. If so, you must pardon me. You know the hell I have suffered on that point, and how tender I am upon it. You know I do not mean wrong. I have been quite clear of the hypo since you left, even better than I was along in the fall. I have seen but once. She seemed very cheerful, and so I said nothing to her about what we spoke of. Old Uncle Billy Herndon is dead, and it is said this evening that Uncle Ben Ferguson will not live. This, I believe, is all the news, and enough at that, unless it were better. Write me immediately upon receipt of this. Your friend, as ever, Lincoln. Springfield, Illinois, February 13th, 1842. Dear Speed, yours of the 1st instant came to hand 3 or 4 days ago. When this shall reach you, you will have been Fanny's husband several days. You know my desire to befriend you is everlasting, that I will never cease while I know how to do anything. But you will always hereafter be on ground that I have never occupied, and consequently, if advice were needed, I might advise wrong. I do fondly hope, however, that you will never again need any comfort from abroad. But should I be mistaken in this, should excessive pleasure still be accompanied with a painful counterpart at times, still let me urge you, as I have ever done, to remember, in the depth and even agony of despondency, that very shortly you are to feel well again. I am now fully convinced that you love her as ardently as you are capable of loving. Your ever being happy in her presence, and your intense anxiety about her health, if there were nothing else, would place this beyond all dispute in my mind. I incline to think it probable that your nerves will fail you occasionally for a while, but once you get them firmly graded now, that trouble is over forever. I think, if I were you, in case my mind were not exactly right, I would avoid being idle. I would immediately engage in some business, or go to making preparations for it, which would be the same thing. If you went through the ceremony calmly, or even with sufficient composure not to excite alarm in any present, you are safe beyond question, and in 2 or 3 months, to say the most, will be the happiest of men. I would desire you to give my particular respects to Fanny, but perhaps you will not wish her to know you have received this, lest she should desire to see it. Make her write me an answer to my last letter to her. At any rate, I would set great value upon a note or letter from her. Write me whenever you have leisure. Yours forever, A. Lincoln. P.S. I have been quite a man since you left. Springfield, February 25th, 1842. Dear Speed, yours of the 16th instant, announcing that Miss Fanny and you are no more twain but one flesh, reached me this morning. I have no way of telling how much happiness I wish you both, though I believe you both can conceive it. I feel somewhat jealous of both of you now. You will be so exclusively concerned for one another that I shall be forgotten entirely. My acquaintance with Miss Fanny, I call her this lest you should think I am speaking of your mother, was too short for me to reasonably hope to be remembered long by her, and still I am sure I shall not forget her soon. Try if you cannot remind her of the debt she owes me, and be sure you do not interfere to prevent her paying it. I regret to learn that you have resolved to not return to Illinois. I shall be very lonesome without you. How miserable things seem to be arranged in this world! If we have no friends, we have no pleasure, and if we have them, we are sure to lose them and be doubly pained by the loss. I did hope she and you would make your home here, but I own I have no right to insist. You owe obligations to her 10,000 times more sacred than you can owe to others, and in that light let them be respected and observed. It is natural that she should desire to remain with her relatives and friends. As to friends, however, she could not need them anywhere. She would have them in abundance here. Give my kind remembrance to Mr. Williamson and his family, particularly Miss Elizabeth, also to your mother, brother, and sisters. Ask little Eliza Davis if she will ride to town with me if I come there again. And finally, give Fanny a double reciprocation of all the love she sent me. Write me often, and believe me, yours forever, Lincoln. P.S. Poor Easthouse is gone at last. He died a while before day this morning. They say he was very loath to die. Springfield, February 25th, 1842. Dear Speed, I received yours of the 12th, written the day you went down to William's place, some days since, but delayed answering it till I should receive the promised one of the 16th, which came last night. I opened that letter with intense anxiety and trepidation, so much that, although it turned out better than I expected, I have hardly yet, at the distance of 10 hours, become calm. I tell you, Speed, our forebodings, for which you and I are peculiar, are all the worst sort of nonsense. I fancied, from the time I received your letter of Saturday, that the one of Wednesday was never to come, and yet it did come, and what is more, it is perfectly clear, both from its tone and handwriting, that you were much happier, or, if you think the term preferable, less miserable when you wrote it than when you wrote the last one before. You had so obviously improved at the very time I so much fancied you would have grown worse. You say that something indescribably horrible and alarming still haunts you. You will not say that 3 months from now, I will venture. When your nerves once get steady again, the whole trouble will be over forever. Nor should you become impatient at their being even very slow in becoming steady. Again, you say, you much fear that Elysium of which you have dreamed so much is never to be realized. Well, if it shall not, I dare swear it will not be the fault of her who is now your wife. I now have no doubt that it is the peculiar misfortune of both you and me to dream dreams of Elysium far exceeding all that anything earthly can realize. Far short of your dreams as you may be, no woman could do more to realize them than that same black-eyed Fanny. If you could but contemplate her through my imagination, it would appear ridiculous to you that any one should for a moment think of being unhappy with her. My old father used to have a saying that if you make a bad bargain, hug it all the tighter, and it occurs to me that if the bargain you have just closed can possibly be called a bad one, it is certainly the most pleasant one for applying that maxim to, which my fancy can by any effort picture. I write another letter, enclosing this, which you can show her if she desires it. I do this because she would think strangely, perhaps, should you tell her that you received no letters from me, or, telling her you do, refuse to let her see them. I close this, entertaining the confident hope that every successive letter I shall have from you, which I here pray may not be few nor far between, may show you possessing a more steady hand and cheerful heart than the last preceding it. As ever, your friend, Lincoln. Springfield, March 27th, 1842. Dear Speed, yours of the 10th instant was received 3 or 4 days since. You know I am sincere when I tell you the pleasure its contents gave me was and is inexpressible. As to your farm matter, I have no sympathy with you. I have no farm, nor ever expect to have, and consequently have not studied the subject enough to be much interested with it. I can only say that I am glad you are satisfied and pleased with it. But on that other subject, to me of the most intense interest, whether in joy or sorrow, I never had the power to withhold my sympathy from you. It cannot be told how it now thrills me with joy to hear you say you are far happier than you ever expected to be. That much I know is enough. I know you too well to suppose your expectations were not, at least, sometimes extravagant, and if the reality exceeds them all, I say, enough, dear Lord. I am not going beyond the truth when I tell you that the short space it took me to read your last letter gave me more pleasure than the total sum of all I have enjoyed since that fatal 1st of January, 1841. Since then it seems to me I should have been entirely happy, but for the never absent idea that there is one, still unhappy, whom I have contributed to make so. That still kills my soul. I cannot but reproach myself for even wishing to be happy while she is otherwise. She accompanied a large party on the railroad cars to Jacksonville last Monday, and on her return spoke, so that I heard of it, of having enjoyed the trip exceedingly. God be praised for that. You know with what sleepless vigilance I have watched you ever since the commencement of your affair, and although I am almost confident it is useless, I cannot forbear once more to say that I think it even yet possible for your spirits to flag down and leave you miserable. If they should, don't fail to remember that they cannot long remain so. One thing I can tell you, which I know you will be glad to hear, and that is that I have seen and scrutinized her feelings as well as I could, and am fully convinced she is far happier now than she has been for the last 15 months past. You will see by the last Sangamon Journal that I have made a temperance speech on the 22nd of February, which I claim that Fanny and you shall read as an act of charity to me, for I cannot learn that anybody else has read it, or is likely to. Fortunately, it is not very long, and I shall deem it a sufficient compliance with my request if one of you listens while the other reads it. As to your Lockridge matter, it is only necessary to say that there has been no court since you left, and that the next commences to-morrow morning, during which I suppose we cannot fail to get a judgment. I wish you would learn of Everett what he would take, over and above a discharge, for all the trouble we have been at, to take his business out of our hands and give it to somebody else. It is impossible to collect money on that or any other claim here now, and although you know I am not a very petulant man, I declare I am almost out of patience with Mr. Everett's endless importunity. It seems like he not only writes all the letters he can himself, but gets everybody else in Louisville and vicinity to be constantly writing to us about his claim. I have always said that Mr. Everett is a very clever fellow, and I am very sorry he cannot be obliged, but it does seem to me he ought to know we are interested to collect his claim, and therefore would do it if we could. I am neither joking nor in a pet when I say we would thank him to transfer his business to some other, without any compensation for what we have done, provided he will see the court cost paid for which we are security. The sweet violet you enclosed came safely to hand, but it was so dry, and mashed so flat, that it crumbled to dust at the first attempt to handle it. The juice that mashed out of it stained a place in the letter, which I mean to preserve and cherish for the sake of her who procured it to be sent. My renewed good wishes to her in particular, and generally to all such of your relations who know me. As ever, Lincoln. Springfield, Illinois, July 4th, 1842. Dear Speed, yours of the 16th June was received only a day or two since. It was not mailed at Louisville till the 25th. You speak of the great time that has elapsed since I wrote you. Let me explain that. Your letter reached here a day or two after I had started on the circuit. I was gone 5 or 6 weeks, so that I got the letters only a few weeks before Butler started to your country. I thought it scarcely worth while to write you the news which he could and would tell you in more detail. On his return, he told me you would write me soon, so I waited for your letter. As to my having been displeased with your advice, surely you know better than that. I know you do, and therefore will not labor to convince you. True, that subject is painful to me, but it is not your silence, or the silence of all the world, that can make me forget it. I acknowledge the correctness of your advice, too, but before I resolve to do the one thing or the other, I must gain my confidence in my own ability to keep my resolves when they are made. In that ability you know I once prided myself, as the only or chief gem of my character. That gem I lost. How and where you know too well. I have not yet regained it, and until I do, I cannot trust myself in any matter of much importance. I believe now that, had you understood my case at the time as well as I understood yours afterwards, by the aid you would have given me, I should have sailed through clear. But that does not now afford me sufficient confidence to begin that, or the like of that, again. You make a kind acknowledgment of your obligations to me for your present happiness. I am much pleased with the acknowledgment, but 1,000 times more am I pleased to know that you enjoy a degree of happiness worthy of an acknowledgment. The truth is, I am not sure that there was any went with me in the part I took in your difficulty. I was drawn to it as by fate. If I would, I could not have done less than I did. I always was superstitious. I believe God made me one of the instruments of bringing your Fanny and you together, which union I have no doubt he had foreordained. Whatever he designs he will do for me yet. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord is my text just now. If, as you say, you have told Fanny all, I should have no objection to her seeing this letter. But for its reference to our friend here, let her seeing it depend upon whether she has ever known anything of my affairs, and if she has not, do not let her. I do not think I can come to Kentucky this season. I am so poor, and make so little headway in the world, that I drop back in a month of idleness as much as I gain in a year's sowing. I should like to visit you again. I should like to see that sis of yours that was absent when I was there, though I suppose she would run away again if she were to hear I was coming. My respects and esteem to all your friends there, and, by your permission, my love to your Fanny. Ever yours, Lincoln. Springfield, October 5th, 1842. Dear Speed, you have heard of my duel with Shields, and I have now to inform you that the dueling business still rages in this city. Day before yesterday, Shields challenged Butler, who accepted, and proposed fighting the next morning at sunrising in Bob Allen's meadow, 100 yards distance, with rifles. To this Whitesides, Shields's second, said no, because of the law. Thus ended duel number 2. Yesterday Whiteside chose to consider himself insulted by Dr. Merryman, so sent him a kind of quasi-challenge, inviting him to meet him at the Planter's House in St. Louis on the next Friday to settle their difficulty. Merryman made me his friend, and sent W. a note, inquiring to know if he meant his note as a challenge, and if so, that he would, according to the law in such a case made and provided, prescribe the terms of the meeting. W. returned for answer, that if M. would meet him at the Planter's House as desired, he would challenge him. M. replied in a note that he denied W.'s right to dictate time and place, but that he, M., would waive the question of time, and meet him at Louisiana, Missouri. Upon my presenting this note to W. and stating verbally its contents, he declined receiving it, saying he had business in St. Louis, and it was as near as Louisiana. Merryman then directed me to notify Whiteside that he should publish the correspondence between them, with such comments as he saw fit. This I did. Thus it stood at bedtime last night. This morning Whiteside, by his friend Shields, is praying for a new trial, on the ground that he was mistaken in Merryman's proposition to meet him at Louisiana, Missouri, thinking it was the State of Louisiana. This Merryman hoots at, and is preparing his publication, while the town is in a ferment, and a street fight somewhat anticipated. But I began this letter, not for what I have been writing, but to say something on that subject which you know to be of such infinite solicitude to me. The immense sufferings you endured from the first days of September till the middle of February you never tried to conceal from me, and I well understood. You have now been the husband of a lovely woman nearly 8 months. That you are happier now than the day you married her, I well know, for without you could not be living. But I have your word for it, too, and the returning elasticity of spirits which is manifested in your letters. But I want to ask a close question. Are you now, in feeling as well as judgment, glad you are married as you are? From anybody but me this would be an impudent question, not to be tolerated, but I know you will pardon it in me. Please answer it quickly, as I am impatient to know. I have sent my love to your Fanny so often I fear she is getting tired of it. However, I venture to tender it again. Yours forever, Lincoln. In the last of these letters, Mr. Lincoln referred to his duel with Shields. That was another of the disagreeable consequences which flowed from his fatal entanglement with Mary. Not content with managing a timid, although half-frantic and refractory lover, her restless spirit led her into new fields of adventure. Her pen was too keen to be idle in the political controversies of the time. As a satirical writer, she had no rival of either sex at Springfield, and few, we venture to say, anywhere else. But that is a dangerous talent. The temptations to use it unfairly are numerous and strong. It inflicts so much pain, and almost necessarily so much injustice, upon those against whom it is directed, that its possessor rarely, if ever, escapes from a controversy without suffering from the desperation it provokes. Mary Todd was not disposed to let her genius rust for want of use, and finding no other victim handy, she turned her attention to James Shields, auditor. She had a friend, one Miss Jane, afterwards Mrs. Trumbull, who helped to keep her literary secrets, and assisted as much as she could in worrying the choleric Irishman. Mr. Francis, the editor, knew very well that Shields was a fighting man, but the pieces sent him by the wicked ladies were so uncommonly rich in point and humor that he yielded to a natural inclination and printed them, one and all. Below we give a few specimens. Letter from the Lost Townships. Lost Townships, August 27, 1842. Dear Mr. Printer, I see you printed that long letter I sent you a spell ago. I'm quite encouraged by it, and can't keep from writing again. I think the printing of my letters will be a good thing all round. It will give me the benefit of being known by the world, and give the world the advantage of knowing what's going on in the lost townships, and give your paper respectability besides. So here comes another. Yesterday afternoon I hurried through cleaning up the dinner dishes, and stepped over to neighbor S. to see if his wife Peggy was as well as might be expected, and hear what they called the baby. Well, when I got there, and just turned round the corner of his log cabin, there he was setting on the doorstep reading a newspaper. "How are you, Jeff?" says I. He sort of started when he heard me, for he hadn't seen me before. "Why," says he, "I'm mad as the devil, Aunt 'Becca." "What about?" says I. "Ain't its hair the right color?" "None of that nonsense, Jeff. There ain't an honester woman in the lost townships than—" "Then who?" says he. "What mischief are you about?" I began to see I was running the wrong trail, and so says I, "Oh, nothing. I guess I was mistaken a little, that's all. But what is it you're mad about?" "Why," says he, "I've been tugging ever since harvest, getting out wheat and hauling it to the river to raise state bank paper enough to pay my tax this year and a little school debt I owe. And now, just as I've got it, here I open this infernal extra register, expecting to find it full of glorious Democratic victories and high-combed cocks, when, lo and behold, I find a set of fellows calling themselves officers of state have forbidden the tax collectors and school commissioners to receive state paper at all. And so here it is, dead on my hands. I don't now believe all the plunder I've got will fetch ready cash enough to pay my taxes and that school debt." I was a good deal thunderstruck myself, for that was the first I had heard of the proclamation, and my old man was pretty much in the same fix with Jeff. We both stood a moment staring at one another, without knowing what to say. At last says I, "Mr. S., let me look at that paper." He handed it to me when I read the proclamation over. "There now," says he, "did you ever see such a piece of impudence and imposition as that?" I saw Jeff was in a good tune for saying some ill-natured things, and so I thought I would just argue a little on the contrary side, and make him rant a spell if I could. "Why," says I, looking as dignified and thoughtful as I could, "it seems pretty tough, to be sure, to have to raise silver where there's none to be raised, but then, you see, there will be danger of loss if it ain't done." "Loss, damnation," says he. "I defy Daniel Webster. I defy King Solomon. I defy the world. I defy, yes, I even defy you, Aunt 'Becca, to show how the people can lose anything by paying their taxes in state paper." "Well," says I, "you see what the officers of state say about it, and they are a discerning set of men. But," says I guess you're mistaken about what the proclamation says. It don't say the people will lose anything by the paper money being taken for taxes. It only says there will be danger of loss. And though it is tolerable plain that the people can't lose by paying their taxes in something they can get easier than silver, instead of having to pay silver, and though it is just as plain that the state can't lose by taking state bank paper, however low it may be, while she owes the bank more than the whole revenue, and can pay that paper over on her debt dollar for dollar, still there is danger of loss to the officers of state, and you know, Jeff, we can't get along without officers of state." "Damn officers of state," says he. "That's what you Whigs are always hurrahing for." "Now, don't swear so, Jeff," says I. "You know I belong to the meeting, and swearing hurts my feelings." "Beg pardon, Aunt 'Becca," says he, "but I do say it's enough to make Dr. Goddard swear, to have tax to pay in silver, for nothing only that Ford may get his $2,000 a year, and Shields his $2,400 a year, and Carpenter his $1,600 a year, and all without danger of loss by taking it in state paper. Yes, yes, it's plain enough now what these officers of state mean by danger of loss. Wash, I suppose, actually lost $1,500 out of the $3,000 that two of these officers of state let him steal from the Treasury by being compelled to take it in state paper. Wonder if we don't have a proclamation before long commanding us to make up this loss to Wash in silver." And so he went on till his breath run out, and he had to stop. I couldn't think of anything to say just then, and so I begun to look over the paper again. "Ay, here's another proclamation, or something like it." "Another," says Jeff, "and whose egg is it, pray?" I looked to the bottom of it, and read aloud, "Your obedient servant, James Shields, Auditor." "Aha," says Jeff, "one of them same three fellows again. Well, read it, and let's hear what of it." I read on till I came to where it says, "The object of this measure is to suspend the collection of the revenue for the current year." Now stop," says he. "That's a lie already, and I don't want to hear of it." "Oh, maybe not," says I. "I say it is a lie. Suspend the collection, indeed! Will the collectors, that have taken their oaths to make the collection, dare to suspend it? Is there anything in the law requiring them to perjure themselves at the bidding of James Shields? Will the greedy gullet of the penitentiary be satisfied with swallowing him instead of all of them, if they should venture to obey him? And would he not discover some danger of loss, and be off about the time it came to taking their places? And suppose the people attempt to suspend by refusing to pay, what then? The collectors would just jerk up their horses and cows and the like, and sell them to the highest bidder for silver in hand, without valuation or redemption. Why, Shields didn't believe that story himself. It was never meant for the truth. If it was true, why was it not writ until 5 days after the proclamation? Why didn't Carlin and Carpenter sign it as well as Shields? Answer me that, Aunt 'Becca. I say it's a lie, and not a well-told one at that. It grins out like a copper dollar. Shields is a fool as well as a liar. With him truth is out of the question, and as for getting a good, bright, passable lie out of him, you might as well try to strike fire from a cake of tallow. I stick to it. It's all an infernal Whig lie." "A Whig lie, highty-tighty!" "Yes, a Whig lie, and it's just like everything the cursed British Whigs do. First they'll do some devilment, and then they'll tell a lie to hide it. And they don't care how plain a lie it is. They think they can cram any sort of a one down the throats of the ignorant locofocos, as they call the Democrats." "Why, Jeff, you're crazy. You don't mean to say Shields is a Whig?" "Yes, I do." "Why, look here, the proclamation is in your own Democratic paper, as you call it." "I know, and what of that? They only printed it to let us Democrats see the deviltry the Whigs are at." "Well, but Shields is the auditor of this this Democratic state." "So he is, and Tyler appointed him to office." "Tyler appointed him?" "Yes, if you must chaw it over. Tyler appointed him. Or if it wasn't him, it was old Granny Harrison, and that's all one. I tell you, Aunt 'Becca, there's no mistake about his being a Whig. Why, his very looks shows it. Everything about him shows it. If I was deaf and blind, I could tell him by the smell. I seed him when I was down in Springfield last winter. They had a sort of a gathering there one night among the grandees. They called it a fair. All the gals about town were there, and all the handsome widows and married women, finicking about, trying to look like gals, tied as tight in the middle and puffed out at both ends, like bundles of fodder that hadn't been stacked yet, but wanted stacking pretty bad. And then they had tables all round the house, covered over with caps and pincushions, and 10,000 such little knick-knacks, trying to sell 'em to the fellows that were bowing and scraping and conjuring about 'em. They wouldn't let no Democrats in, for fear they'd disgust the ladies, or scare the little gals, or dirty the floor. I looked in at the window, and there was this same fellow Shields floating about on the air, without heft or earthly substance, just like a lock of cat fur where cats had been fighting. He was paying his money to this one and that one and t'other one, and suffering great loss because it wasn't silver instead of state paper. And the sweet distress he seemed to be in, his very features, in the ecstatic agony of his soul, spoke audibly and distinctly. 'Dear girls, it is distressing, but I cannot marry you all. Too well I know how much you suffer. But do remember it is not my fault that I am so handsome and so interesting. As this last was expressed by a most exquisite contortion of his face, he seized hold of one of their hands, and squeezed and held on to it about a quarter of an hour. "Oh, my good fellow," says I to myself, "if that was one of our Democratic gals in the Lost Townships, the way you'd get a brass pin let into you would be about up to the head. He a Democrat! Fiddlesticks! I tell you, Aunt 'Becca, he's a Whig, and no mistake. Nobody but a Whig could make such a conceited dunce of himself." "Well," says I, "maybe he is. But if he is, I'm mistaken the worst sort. Maybe so, maybe so. But if I am, I'll suffer by it. I'll be a Democrat if it turns out that Shields is a Whig. Consider it you shall be a Whig if he turns out a Democrat." "A bargain, by jingoes," says he. "But how will we find out?" "Why," says I, "we'll just write and ax the printer." "Agreed again," says he; "and by thunder, if it does turn out that Shields is a Democrat, I never will— Jefferson! Jefferson!" "What do you want, Peggy?" "Do get through your everlasting chatter sometime, and bring me a gourd of water. The child's been a crying for a drink this livelong hour." "Let it die, then. It may as well die for water as to be taxed to death to fatten officers of state." Jeff run off to get the water, though, just like he hadn't been saying anything spiteful, for he's a real good-hearted fellow, after all, once you get at the foundation of him. I walked into the house, and, "Why, Peggy," says I declare we like to forgot you altogether." "Oh, yes," says she. "When a body can't help themselves, everybody soon forgets 'em. But, thank God, by day after to-morrow I shall be well enough to milk the cows and pen the calves, and wring the contrary ones' tails for 'em, and no thanks to nobody." "Good evening, Peggy," says I, and so I sloped, for I seed she was mad at me for making Jeff neglect her so long. "And now, Mr. Printer, will you be sure to let us know in your next paper whether this Shields is a Whig or a Democrat? I don't care about it for myself, for I know well enough how it is already, but I want to convince Jeff. It may do some good to let him and others like him know who and what those officers of state are. It may help to send the present hypocritical set to where they belong, and to fill the places they now disgrace with men who will do more work for less pay, and take fewer airs while they are doing it. It ain't sensible to think that the same men who get us into trouble will change their course. And yet it's pretty plain, if some change for the better is not made, it's not long that either Peggy or I or any of us will have a cow left to milk or a calf's tail to wring. Yours truly, Rebecca . Lost Townships, September 8th, 1842. Dear Mr. Printer, I was a-standing at the spring yesterday, a-washing out butter, when I seed Jim Snooks a-riding up towards the house, for very life like, when, just as I was a-wondering what on earth was the matter with him, he stops suddenly, and says he, "Aunt 'Becca, here's something for you," and with that he hands out your letter. Well, you see, I steps out towards him, not thinking that I had both hands full of butter, and seeing I couldn't take the letter, you know, without greasing it, I says, "Jim, just you open it and read it for me." Well, Jim opens it and reads it, and would you believe it, Mr. Editor? I was so completely dumbfounded and turned into stone that there I stood in the sun, a-working the butter, and it a-running onto the ground, while he read the letter, that I never thunk what I was about till the hull of it run melted on the ground and was lost. Now, sir, it's not for the butter, nor the price of the butter, but the Lord have mercy on us, I wouldn't have such another fright for a whole firkin of it. Why, when I found out that it was the man what Jeff seed down to the fair that had demanded the author of my letters, threatening to take personal satisfaction of the writer, I was so scart that I thought I should quill wheel right where I was. You say that Mr. S. is offended at being compared to cat's fur, and is as mad as a March hare. That ain't far, because I told about the squeezing. Now, I want you to tell Mr. S. that rather than fight, I'll make any apology, and if he wants personal satisfaction, let him only come here, and he may squeeze my hand as hard as I squeeze the butter, And if that ain't personal satisfaction, I can only say that he is the first man that was not satisfied with squeezing my hand. If this should not answer, there is one more thing that I would do rather than get a licking. I have all along expected to die a widow, but as Mr. S. is rather good looking than otherwise, I must say I don't care if we compromise the matter by, really, Mr. Printer, I can't help blushing, but well, it must come out, but widowed modesty. Well, if I must, I must. Wouldn't he, maybe sorta, let the old grudge drop if I was to consent to be his wife? I know he's a fightin' man and would rather fight than eat, but isn't marrying better than fightin', though it does sometimes run into it? And I don't think, upon the whole, that I'd be such a bad match, neither. I'm not over 60, and am just 4 feet 3 in my bare feet, and not much more round the girth. And for colour, I wouldn't turn my back to nary gal in the Lost Townships. But after all, maybe I'm counting my chickens before they're hatched, and dreaming of matrimonial bliss when the only alternative reserved for me may be a licking. Jeff tells me the way these fire-eaters do is to give the challenged party choice of weapons, etc., which, being the case, I'll tell you in confidence that I never fights with anything but broomsticks, or hot water, or a shovel full of coals, or some such thing, the former of which, being somewhat like a shillelagh, may not be very objectionable to him. I will give him choice, however, in one thing, and that is, whether, when we fight, I shall wear breeches or he petticoats, for I presume that change is sufficient to place us on an equality. Yours, etc., Rebecca . P.S. Just say to your friend, if he concludes to marry rather than fight, I shall only enforce one condition. That is, if he should ever happen to gallant any young gals home of nights from our house, he must not squeeze their hands. It is by no means a subject of wonder that these publications threw Mr. James Shields into a state of wrath. A thin-skinned, sensitive, high-minded, and high-tempered man, tender of his honor, and an Irishman besides, it would have been strange indeed if he had not felt like snuffing blood. But his rage only afforded new delights to his tormentors, and when it reached its height, Aunt Becca transformed herself into Kathleen, and broke out in rhymes, like the following, which Miss Jane's brother Bill kindly consented to drop for the amiable ladies. For the Journal. Ye Jews' harps awake, the A is won, Rebecca the widow has gained Aaron's son, the pride of the North from Emerald Isle has been wooed and won by a woman's smile. The combat's relinquished, old love's all forgot, to the widow he's bound, oh bright be his lot. In the smiles of the conquest so lately achieved, joyful be his bride, widowed modesty relieved. The footsteps of time tread lightly on flowers, may the cares of this world never darken his hours. But the pleasures of life are fickle and coy, as the smiles of a maiden sent off to destroy. Happy groom, in sadness far distant from thee, the fair girls dream only of past times of glee, enjoyed in thy presence, while the soft blarneyed store will be fondly remembered as relics of yore. And hands that in rapture you oft would have pressed, in prayer will be clasped that your lot may be blessed. Kathleen. It was too bad. Mr. Shields could stand it no longer. He sent General Whiteside to Mr. Francis to demand the name of the person who wrote the letters from the Lost Townships, and Mr. Francis told him it was A. Lincoln. This information led to a challenge, a sudden scampering off of parties and friends to Missouri, a meeting, an explanation, and a peaceful return. End of section 15. Section 16 of The Life of Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Casper. The Life of Abraham Lincoln by Ward Hill Lamon. Chapter 11, Part 3. Abraham Lincoln, in the field of honor, sword in hand, maneuvered by a second learned in the duello, would be an attractive spectacle under any circumstances; but with a celebrated man for an antagonist, and a lady's humor the occasion, the scene is one of transcendent interest, and the documents which describe it are well entitled to a place in his history. The letter of Mr. Shields's second, being first in date, is first in order. Springfield, October 3, 1842. To the Editor of the Sangamon Journal. Sir, to prevent misrepresentation of the recent affair between Messrs. Shields and Lincoln, I think it proper to give a brief narrative of the facts of the case as they came within my knowledge, for the truth of which I hold myself responsible, and request you to give the same publication. An offensive article in relation to Mr. Shields appeared in the Sangamon Journal of the 2nd September last, and on demanding the author, Mr. Lincoln was given up by the editor. Mr. Shields, previous to this demand, made arrangements to go to Quincy on public business, and before his return Mr. Lincoln had left for Tremont to attend the court, with the intention, as we learned, of remaining on the circuit several weeks. Mr. Shields, on his return, requested me to accompany him to Tremont, and on arriving there we found that Dr. Merryman and Mr. Butler had passed us in the night and got there before us. We arrived in Tremont on the 17th ultima, and Mr. Shields addressed a note to Mr. Lincoln immediately, informing him that he was given up as the author of some articles that appeared in the Sangamon Journal, one more over the signature having made its appearance at this time, and requesting him to retract the offensive allusions contained in said articles in relation to his private character. Mr. Shields handed this note to me to deliver to Mr. Lincoln, and directed me at the same time not to enter into any verbal communication, or be the bearer of any verbal explanation, as such were always liable to misapprehension. This note was delivered by me to Mr. Lincoln, stating at the same time that I would call at his convenience for an answer. Mr. Lincoln, in the evening of the same day, handed me a letter addressed to Mr. Shields. In this he gave or offered no explanation, but stated therein that he could not submit to answer further, on the ground that Shields's note contained an assumption of facts and also a menace. Mr. Shields then addressed him another note, in which he disavowed all intention to menace, and requested to know whether he, Mr. Lincoln, was the author of either of the articles which appeared in the journal headed "Lost Townships" and signed "Rebecca," and if so, he repeated his request of a retraction of the offensive matter in relation to his private character. If not, his denial would be held sufficient. This letter was returned to Mr. Shields unanswered, with a verbal statement that there could be no further negotiation between them until the first note was withdrawn. Mr. Shields thereupon sent a note designating me as his friend, to which Mr. Lincoln replied by designating Dr. Merryman. These three last notes passed on Monday morning, the 19th. Dr. Merryman handed me Mr. Lincoln's last note when by ourselves. I remarked to Dr. Merryman that the matter was now submitted to us, and that I would propose that he and myself should pledge our words of honor to each other to try to agree upon terms of amicable arrangement, and to compel our principals to accept of them. To this he readily assented, and we shook hands upon the pledge. It was then mutually agreed that we should adjourn to Springfield, and there procrastinate the matter, for the purpose of effecting the secret arrangement between him and myself. All this I kept concealed from Mr. Shields. Our horse had got a little lame in going to Tremont, and Dr. Merryman invited me to take a seat in his buggy. I accepted the invitation the more readily, as I thought that leaving Mr. Shields in Tremont until his horse would be in better condition to travel would facilitate the private agreement between Dr. Merryman and myself. I traveled to Springfield part of the way with him and part with Mr. Lincoln, but nothing passed between us on the journey in relation to the matter at hand. We arrived in Springfield on Monday night. About noon on Tuesday, to my astonishment, a proposition was made to meet in Missouri, within 3 miles of Alton, on the next Thursday. The weapons, cavalry broadswords of the largest size, the parties to stand on each side of a barrier, and to be confined to a limited space. As I had not been consulted at all on the subject, and considering the private understanding between Dr. Merryman and myself, and it being known that Mr. Shields was left at Tremont, such a proposition took me by surprise. However, being determined not to violate the laws of the State, I declined agreeing upon the terms until we should meet in Missouri. Immediately after, I called upon Dr. Merryman, and withdrew the pledge of honor between him and myself in relation to a secret arrangement. I started after this to meet Mr. Shields, and met him about 20 miles from Springfield. It was late on Tuesday night when we both reached the city, and learned that Dr. Merryman had left for Missouri, Mr. Lincoln having left before the proposition was made, as Dr. Merryman had himself informed me. The time and place made it necessary to start at once. We left Springfield at 11 o'clock on Tuesday night, traveled all night, and arrived in Hillsborough on Wednesday morning, where we took in General Ewing. From there we went to Alton, where we arrived on Thursday, and as the proposition required 3 friends on each side, I was joined by General Ewing and Dr. Hope as the friends of Mr. Shields. We then crossed to Missouri, where a proposition was made by General Herndon and Dr. English, who had arrived there in the meantime as mutual friends, to refer the matter to, I think, 4 friends for a settlement. This I believed Mr. Shields would refuse, and declined seeing him; but Dr. Hope, who conferred with him upon the subject, returned, and stated that Mr. Shields declined settling the matter through any other than the friends he had selected to stand by him on that occasion. The friends of both the parties finally agreed to withdraw the papers temporarily, to give the friends of Mr. Lincoln an opportunity to explain. Whereupon the friends of Mr. Lincoln, to wit, Messrs. Merryman, Bledsoe, and Butler, made a full and satisfactory explanation in relation to the article, which appeared in the Sangamon Journal of the 2nd, the only one written by him. This was all done without the knowledge or consent of Mr. Shields, and he refused to accede to it until Dr. Hope, General Ewing, and myself declared the apology sufficient, and that we could not sustain him in going further. I think it necessary to state, further, that no explanation or apology had been previously offered on the part of Mr. Lincoln to Mr. Shields, and that none was ever communicated by me to him, nor was any ever offered to me, unless a paper read to me by Dr. Merryman after he had handed me the broadsword proposition on Tuesday. I heard so little of the reading of the paper that I do not know fully what it purported to be, and I was the less inclined to inquire, as Mr. Lincoln was then gone to Missouri, and Mr. Shields not yet arrived from Tremont. In fact, I could not entertain any offer of the kind, unless upon my own responsibility, and that I was not disposed to do after what had already transpired. I make this statement, as I am about to be absent for some time, and I think it due to all concerned to give a true version of the matter before I leave. Your obedient servant, John D. Whiteside. To which Mr. Merryman replied: Springfield, October 8, 1842. Editors of the Journal. Gents, by your paper of Friday, I discover that General Whiteside has published his version of the late affair between Messrs. Shields and Lincoln. I now bespeak a hearing of my version of the same affair, which shall be true and full as to all material facts. On Friday evening, the 16th of September, I learned that Mr. Shields and General Whiteside had started in pursuit of Mr. Lincoln, who was at Tremont attending court. I knew that Mr. Lincoln was wholly unpracticed both as to the diplomacy and weapons commonly employed in similar affairs, and I felt it my duty as a friend to be with him, and, so far as in my power, to prevent any advantage being taken of him as to either his honor or his life. Accordingly, Mr. Butler and myself started,
passed Shields and Whiteside in the night, and arrived at Tremont ahead of them Saturday morning. I told Mr. Lincoln what was brewing, and asked him what course he proposed to himself. He stated that he was wholly opposed to duelling, and would do anything to avoid it that might not degrade him in the estimation of himself and friends. But if such degradation or a fight were the only alternative, he would fight. In the afternoon Shields and Whiteside arrived, and very soon the former sent to Mr. Lincoln by the latter the following note or letter: Tremont, September 17, 1842. A. Lincoln, Esquire. I regret that my absence on public business compelled me to postpone a matter of private consideration a little longer than I could have desired. It will only be necessary, however, to account for it by informing you that I have been to Quincy on business that would not admit of delay. I will now state briefly the reasons of my troubling you with this communication, the disagreeable nature of which I regret, as I had hoped to avoid any difficulty with any one in Springfield while residing there, by endeavoring to conduct myself in such a way amongst both my political friends and opponents as to escape the necessity of any. While thus abstaining from giving provocation, I have become the object of slander, vituperation, and personal abuse, which, were I capable of submitting to, I would prove myself worthy of the whole of it. In 2 or 3 of the last numbers of the Sangamon Journal, articles of the most personal nature and calculated to degrade me have made their appearance. On inquiring, I was informed by the editor of that paper, through the medium of my friend General Whiteside, that you are the author of those articles. This information satisfies me that I have become, by some means or other, the object of your secret hostility. I will not take the trouble of inquiring into the reason of all this, but I will take the liberty of requiring a full, positive, and absolute retraction of all offensive allusions used by you in these communications in relation to my private character and standing as a man, as an apology for the insults conveyed in them. This may prevent consequences which no one will regret more than myself. Your obedient servant, James Shields. About sunset General Whiteside called again, and received from Mr. Lincoln the following answer to Mr. Shields's note: Tremont, September 17, 1842. James Shields, Esquire. Your note of today was handed me by General Whiteside. In that note you say you have been informed, through the medium of the editor of the Journal, that I am the author of certain articles in that paper which you deem personally abusive of you, and without stopping to inquire whether I really am the author, or to point out what is offensive in them, you demand an unqualified retraction of all that is offensive, and then proceed to hint at consequences. Now, sir, there is in this so much assumption of facts, and so much of menace as to consequences, that I cannot submit to answer that note any further than I have, and to add that the consequence to which I suppose you allude would be matter of as great regret to me as it could possibly be to you. Respectfully, A. Lincoln. In about an hour General Whiteside called again with another note from Mr. Shields, but after conferring with Mr. Butler for a long time, say 2 or 3 hours, returned without presenting the note to Mr. Lincoln. This was in consequence of an assurance from Mr. Butler that Mr. Lincoln could not receive any communication from Mr. Shields unless it were a withdrawal of his first note or a challenge. Mr. Butler further stated to General Whiteside that on the withdrawal of the first note, and a proper and gentlemanly request for an explanation, he had no doubt one would be given. General Whiteside admitted that that was the course Mr. Shields ought to pursue, but deplored that his furious and intractable temper prevented his having any influence with him to that end. General W. then requested us to wait with him until Monday morning, that he might endeavor to bring Mr. Shields to reason. On Monday morning he called and presented Mr. Lincoln the same note as Mr. Butler says he had brought on Saturday evening. It was as follows: Tremont, September 17, 1842. A. Lincoln, Esquire. In your reply to my note of this date, you intimate that I assume facts and menace consequences, and that you cannot submit to answer it further. As now, sir, you desire it, I will be a little more particular, the editor of the Sangamon Journal gave me to understand that you are the author of an article which appeared, I think, in that paper of the 2nd September instant, headed "The Lost Townships," and signed Rebecca or Becca. I would therefore take the liberty of asking whether you are the author of said article, or any other over the same signature, which has appeared in any of the late numbers of that paper. If so, I repeat my request of an absolute retraction of all offensive allusion contained therein in relation to my private character and standing. If you are not the author of any of the articles, your denial will be sufficient. I will say further, it is not my intention to menace, but to do myself justice. Your obedient servant, James Shields. This Mr. Lincoln perused, and returned to General Whiteside, telling him verbally that he did not think it consistent with his honor to negotiate for peace with Mr. Shields unless Mr. Shields would withdraw his former offensive letter. In a very short time General Whiteside called with a note from Mr. Shields, designating General Whiteside as his friend, to which Mr. Lincoln instantly replied, designating me as his. On meeting General Whiteside, he proposed that we should pledge our honor to each other that we would endeavor to settle the matter amicably, to which I agreed, and stated to him the only conditions on which it could be so settled, namely, the withdrawal of Mr. Shields's first note, which he appeared to think reasonable, and regretted that that note had been written, saying, however, that he had endeavored to prevail on Mr. Shields to write a milder one, but had not succeeded. He added, too, that I must promise not to mention it, as he would not dare to let Mr. Shields know that he was negotiating peace; for, said he would challenge me next, and as soon cut my throat as not. Not willing that he should suppose my principle less dangerous than his own, I promised not to mention our pacific intentions to Mr. Lincoln or any other person, and we started for Springfield forthwith. We all, except Mr. Shields, arrived in Springfield late at night on Monday. We discovered that the affair had somehow got great publicity in Springfield, and that an arrest was probable. To prevent this, it was agreed by Mr. Lincoln and myself that he should leave early on Tuesday morning. Accordingly, he prepared the following instructions for my guide, on a suggestion from Mr. Butler that he had reason to believe that an attempt would be made by the opposite party to have the matter accommodated. In case Whiteside shall signify a wish to adjust this affair without further difficulty, let him know that if the present papers be withdrawn, and a note from Mr. Shields, asking to know if I am the author of the articles of which he complains, and asking that I shall make him gentlemanly satisfaction if I am the author, and this without menace or dictation as to what that satisfaction shall be, a pledge is made that the following answer shall be given. I did write the Lost Township letter which appeared in the Journal on the 2nd instant, but had no participation in any form in any other article alluding to you. I wrote that wholly for political effect. I had no intention of injuring your personal or private character or standing as a man or a gentleman, and I did not then think, and do not now think, that that article could produce or has produced that effect against you, and had I anticipated such an effect I would have forborne to write it. And I will add that your conduct towards me, so far as I knew, had always been gentlemanly, and that I had no personal pique against you, and no cause for any. If this should be done, I leave it to you to manage what shall and what shall not be published. If nothing like this is done, the preliminaries of the fight are to be: first, weapons, cavalry broadswords of the largest size, precisely equal in all respects, and such as now used by the cavalry company at Jacksonville. Second, position, a plank 10 feet long and from 9 to 12 inches broad, to be firmly fixed on edge on the ground as the line between us, which neither is to pass his foot over upon forfeit of his life. Next, a line drawn on the ground on either side of said plank, and parallel with it, each at the distance of the whole length of the sword and 3 feet additional from the plank, and the passing of his own such line by either party during the fight shall be deemed a surrender of the contest. Third, time, on Thursday evening at 5 o'clock, if you can get it so, but in no case to be at a greater distance of time than Friday evening at 5 o'clock. 4th, place, within 3 miles of Alton, on the opposite side of the river, the particular spot to be agreed on by you. Any preliminary details coming within the above rules you are at liberty to make at your discretion, but you are in no case to swerve from these rules or to pass beyond their limits. In the course of the forenoon I met General Whiteside, and he again intimated a wish to adjust the matter amicably. I then read him Mr. Lincoln's instructions as to an adjustment, and the terms of the hostile meeting, if there must be one, both at the same time. He replied that it was useless to talk of an adjustment if it could only be effected by the withdrawal of Mr. Shields's paper, for such a withdrawal Mr. Shields would never consent to, adding that he would as soon think of asking Mr. Shields to butt his brains out against a brick wall as to withdraw that paper. He proceeded, "I see but one course. That is a desperate remedy. 'Tis to tell them, if they will not make the matter up, they must fight us." I replied that if he chose to fight Mr. Shields to compel him to do right, he might do so; but as for Mr. Lincoln, he was on the defensive, and I believed in the right, and I should do nothing to compel him to do wrong. Such withdrawal having been made indispensable by Mr. Lincoln, I cut this matter short as to an adjustment, and I proposed to General Whiteside to accept the terms of the fight, which he refused to do until Mr. Shields's arrival in town, but agreed verbally that Mr. Lincoln's friends should procure the broadswords and take them to the ground. In the afternoon he came to me, saying that some persons were swearing out affidavits to have us arrested, and that he intended to meet Mr. Shields immediately and proceed to the place designated, lamenting, however, that I would not delay the time, that he might procure the interference of Governor Ford and General Ewing to mollify Mr. Shields. I told him that an accommodation, except upon the terms I had mentioned, was out of the question; that to delay the meeting was to facilitate our arrest, and as I was determined not to be arrested, I should leave town in 15 minutes. I then pressed his acceptance of the preliminaries, which he disclaimed upon the ground that it would interfere with his oath of office as Fund Commissioner. I then, with 2 other friends, went to Jacksonville, where we joined Mr. Lincoln about 11 o'clock on Tuesday night. Wednesday morning we procured the broadswords and proceeded to Alton, where we arrived about 11 a.m. on Thursday. The other party were in town before us. We crossed the river, and they soon followed. Shortly after, General Herndon and Dr. English presented to General Whiteside and myself the following note: Alton, September 22, 1842. Messrs. Whiteside and Merryman, as the mutual personal friends of Messrs. Shields and Lincoln, but without authority from either, we earnestly desire to see a reconciliation of the misunderstanding which exists between them. Such difficulties should always be arranged amicably, if it is possible to do so with honor to both parties. Believing ourselves that such an arrangement can possibly be effected, we respectfully but earnestly submit the following proposition for your consideration. Let the whole difficulty be submitted to 4 or more gentlemen, to be selected by yourselves, who shall consider the affair and report thereupon for your consideration. John J. Herndon, E. W. English. To this proposition General Whiteside agreed. I declined to do so without consulting Mr. Lincoln. Mr. Lincoln remarked that as they had accepted the proposition, he would do so, but directed that his friends should make no terms except those first proposed. Whether the adjustment was finally made upon those very terms and no other, let the following documents attest: Missouri, September 22, 1842. Gentlemen, all papers in relation to the matter in controversy between Mr. Shields and Mr. Lincoln having been withdrawn by the friends of the parties concerned, the friends of Mr. Shields ask the friends of Mr. Lincoln to explain all offensive matter in the articles which appeared in the Sangamon Journal of the 2nd, 9th, and 16th of September, under the signature of Rebecca, and headed Lost Townships. It is due to General Herndon and Mr. English to state that their interference was of the most courteous and gentlemanly character. John D. Whiteside, William Lee D. Edwino, T. M. Hope. Missouri, September 22nd, 1842. Gentlemen, all papers in relation to the matter in controversy between Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Shields having been withdrawn by the friends of the parties concerned, we, the undersigned friends of Mr. Lincoln, in accordance with your request that explanation of Mr. Lincoln's publication in relation to Mr. Shields in the Sangamon Journal of the 2nd, 9th, and 16th of September be made, take pleasure in saying that although Mr. Lincoln was the writer of the article signed Rebecca in the Journal of the 2nd, and that only, yet he had no intention of injuring the personal or private character or standing of Mr. Shields as a gentleman or a man, and that Mr. Lincoln did not think, nor does he now think, that said article could produce such an effect, and had Mr. Lincoln anticipated such an effect, he would have forborne to write it. We will further state that said article was written solely for political effect, and not to gratify any personal pique against Mr. Shields, for he had none and knew of no cause for any. It is due to General Hanlon and Mr. English to say that their interference was of the most courteous and gentlemanly character. E. H. Merryman, A. T. Bledsoe, William Butler. Let it be observed now that Mr. Shields's friends, after agreeing to the arbitrament of 4 disinterested gentlemen, declined the contract, saying that Mr. Shields wished his own friends to act for him. They then proposed that we should explain without any withdrawal of papers. This was promptly and firmly refused, and General Whiteside himself pronounced the papers withdrawn. They then produced a note requesting us to disavow all offensive intentions in the publications, etc., etc. This we declined answering, and only responded to the above request for an explanation. These are the material facts in relation to the matter, and I think present the case in a very different light from the garbled and curtailed statement of General Whiteside. Why he made that statement I know not, unless he wished to detract from the honor of Mr. Lincoln. This was ungenerous, more particularly as he, on the ground, requested us not to make in our explanation any quotations from the Rebecca papers, also not to make public the terms of reconciliation, and to unite with them in defending the honorable character of the adjustment. General W., in his publication, says, "The friends of both parties agreed to withdraw the papers temporarily, to give the friends of Mr. Lincoln an opportunity to explain." This I deny. I say the papers were withdrawn to enable Mr. Shields's friends to ask an explanation, and I appeal to the documents for proof of my position. But looking over these documents, it will be seen that Mr. Shields had not before asked for an explanation, but had all the time been dictatorially insisting upon a retraction. General Whiteside, in his communication, brings to light much of Mr. Shields's manifestations of bravery behind the scenes. I can do nothing of the kind for Mr. Lincoln. He took his stand when I first met him at Tremont, and maintained it calmly to the last, without difficulty or difference between himself and his friends. I cannot close this article, lengthy as it is, without testifying to the honorable and gentlemanly conduct of General Ewing and Dr. Hope. Nor, indeed, can I say that I saw anything objectionable in the course of General Whiteside up to the time of his communication. This is so replete with prevarication and misrepresentation that I cannot accord to the General that candor which I once supposed him to possess. He complains that I did not procrastinate time according to agreement. He forgets that by his own act he cut me off from that chance in inducing me by promise not to communicate our secret contract to Mr. Lincoln. Moreover, I could see no consistency in wishing for an extension of time at that stage of the affair, when in the outset they were in so precipitate a hurry that they could not wait 3 days for Mr. Lincoln to return from Tremont, but must hasten there, apparently with the intention of bringing the matter to a speedy issue. He complains, too, that after inviting him to take a seat in my buggy, I never broached the subject to him on our route here. But was I the defendant in the case, with a challenge hanging over me, to make advances and beg a reconciliation? Absurd! Moreover, the valorous general forgets that he beguiled the tedium of that journey by recounting to me his exploits in many a well-fought battle, dangers by flood and field in which I don't believe he ever participated, doubtless with a view to produce a salutary effect upon my nerves, and to impress me with a proper notion of his fire-eating propensities. One more main point of his argument, and I have done. The General seems to be troubled with a convenient shortness of memory on some occasions. He does not remember that any explanations were offered at any time, unless it were a paper read when the broadsword proposition was tendered, when his mind was so confused by the anticipated clatter of broadswords, or something else, that he did not know fully what it purported to be. The truth is that by unwisely refraining from mentioning it to his principal, he placed himself in a dilemma which he is now endeavoring to shuffle out of. By his inefficiency and want of knowledge of those laws which govern gentlemen in matters of this kind, he has done great injustice to his principal, a gentleman who I believe is ready at all times to vindicate his honor manfully, but who has been unfortunate in the selection of his friend, and this fault he is now trying to wipe out by doing an act of still greater injustice to Mr. Lincoln. E. H. Merryman. And so Mr. Lincoln acknowledged himself to have been the author of one of the Lost Township letters. Whether he was or not was known only perhaps to Miss Todd and himself. At the time of their date he was having secret meetings with her at Mr. Francis's house, and endeavoring to nerve himself to the duty of marrying her, with what success the letters to Speed are abundant evidence. It is probable that Mary composed them fresh from these stolen conferences, that some of Mr. Lincoln's original conceptions and peculiarities of style unwittingly crept into them, and that here and there he altered and amended her manuscript before it went to the printer. Such a connection with a lady's productions made it obligatory upon him to defend them. But why avow one and disavow the rest? It is more than likely that he was determined to take just enough responsibility to fight upon, provided Shields should prove incorrigible, and not enough to prevent a peaceful issue if the injured gentleman should be inclined to accept an apology. After his marriage, Mr. Lincoln took up his residence at the Globe Tavern, where he had a room and boarding for man and wife for the moderate sum of $4 per week. But notwithstanding cheap living, he was still as poor as ever, and gave poverty as one of his reasons for not paying a friendly visit which seemed to be expected of him. At the bar and in political affairs he continued to work with as much energy as before, although his political prospects seem just now to have suffered an unexpected eclipse. In 1843, Lincoln, Herndon, and Baker were candidates for the Whig Congressional nomination, but between Herndon and Baker there was bitter hostility, and between Baker and Lincoln suspicion and dislike. The contest was long and fierce, but before it was over, Lincoln reluctantly withdrew in favor of Baker. He had had a hard time of it, and had been compelled to meet accusations of a very strange character. Among other things, he was charged with being an aristocrat, with having deserted his old friends the people by marrying a proud woman on account of her blood and family. This hurt him keenly, and he took great pains to disprove it. But this was not all. He was called an infidel by some, a Presbyterian here, an Episcopalian there, so that by turns he incurred the hostility of all the most powerful religious societies in the district. On the 24th of March he wrote to Mr. Speed as follows: Springfield, March 24th, 1843. Dear Speed, we had a meeting of the Whigs of the county here on last Monday to appoint delegates to a district convention, and Baker beat me and got the delegation instructed to go for him. The meeting, in spite of my attempt to decline it, appointed me one of the delegates, so that in getting Baker the nomination I shall be fixed a good deal like a fellow who is made a groomsman to a man that has cut him out, and is marrying his own dear gal. About the prospects of your having a namesake at our town, can't say exactly yet. A. Lincoln. He was now a Baker delegate, pledged to get him the nomination if he could, and yet he was far from giving up the contest in his own behalf. Only 2 days after the letter to Speed, he wrote to Mr. Morris: Springfield, Illinois, March 26, 1843. Friend Morris: Your letter of the 23rd was received on yesterday morning, and for which, instead of an excuse which you thought proper to ask, I tender you my sincere thanks. It is truly gratifying to me to learn that, while the people of Sangamon have cast me off, my old friends of Menard, who have known me longest and best, stick to me. It would astonish, if not amuse, the older citizens, a stranger, friendless, uneducated, penniless boy, working on a flatboat at $10 per month, to learn that I have been put down here as a candidate of pride, wealth, and aristocratic family distinction. Yet so chiefly it was. There was, too, the strangest combination of church influence against me. Baker is a Campbellite, and therefore, as I suppose, with few exceptions, got all that church. My wife has some relations in the Presbyterian churches, and some in the Episcopal churches, and therefore, wherever it would tell, I was set down as either the one or the other, while it was everywhere contended that no Christian ought to go for me, because I belonged to no church, was suspected of being a deist, and had talked about fighting a duel. With all these things Baker, of course, had nothing to do, nor do I complain of them. As to his own church going for him, I think that was right enough, and as to the influences I have spoken of in the other, though they were very strong, it would be grossly untrue and unjust to charge that they acted upon them in a body, or were very near so. I only mean that those influences levied a tax of a considerable per cent upon my strength throughout the religious controversy. But enough of this. You say that in choosing a candidate for Congress you have an equal right with Sangamon, and in this you are undoubtedly earnest. In agreeing to withdraw if the Whigs of Sangamon should go against me, I did not mean that they alone were worth consulting, but that if she, with her heavy delegation, should be against me, it would be impossible for me to succeed, and therefore I had as well decline. And in relation to Menard having rights, permit me fully to recognize them, and to express the opinion that if she and Mason act circumspectly, they will in the convention be able so far to enforce their rights as to decide absolutely which one of the candidates shall be successful. Let me show the reason of this. Hardin or some other Morgan candidate will get Putnam, Marshall, Woodford, Tazewell, and Logan, make 16. Then you and Mason, having 3, can give the victory to either side. You say you shall instruct your delegates for me unless I object. I certainly shall not object. That would be too pleasant a compliment for me to tread in the dust. And besides, if anything should happen, which however is not probable, by which Baker should be thrown out of the fight, I would be at liberty to accept the nomination if I could get it. I do, however, feel myself bound not to hinder him in any way from getting the nomination. I should despise myself were I to attempt it. I think, then, it would be proper for your meeting to appoint 3 delegates, and to instruct them to go for someone as a first choice, someone else as a second, and perhaps someone as a third. And if in those instructions I were named as the first choice, it would gratify me very much. If you wish to hold the balance of power, it is important for you to attend to and secure the vote of Mason also. You should be sure to have men appointed delegates that you know you can safely confide in. If yourself and James Short were appointed for your county, all would be safe. But whether Jim's woman affair a year ago might not be in the way of his appointment is a question. I don't know whether you know it, but I know him to be as honorable a man as there is in the world. You have my permission and even request to show this letter to Short, but to no one else, unless it be a very particular friend who you know will not speak of it. Yours as ever, A. Lincoln. P.S. Will you write me again? To Martin M. Morris, Petersburg, 111. And finally, to Speed on the same subject. Springfield, May 18, 1843. Dear Speed, yours of the 9th instant is duly received, which I do not meet as a bore, but as a most welcome visitor. I will answer the business part of it first. In relation to our Congress matter here, you were right in supposing I would support the nominee. Neither Baker nor I, however, is the man, but Herndon, so far as I can judge from present appearances. We shall have no split or trouble about the matter. All will be harmony. In relation to the coming events about which Butler wrote you, I had not heard one word before I got your letter, but I have so much confidence in the judgment of a Butler on such a subject that I incline to think there may be some reality in it. What day does Butler appoint? By the way, how do events of the same sort come on in your family? Are you possessing houses and lands and oxen and asses and men servants and maid servants, and begetting sons and daughters? We are not keeping house, but boarding at the Globe Tavern, which is very well kept now by a widow lady of the name of Beck. Our room, the same Dr. Wallace occupied there, and boarding, only costs us $4 a week. Ann Todd was married something more than a year since to a fellow by the name of Campbell, and who, Mary says, is pretty much of a dunce, though he has a little money and property. They live in Boonville, Missouri, and have not been heard from lately enough for me to say anything about her health. I reckon it will scarcely be in our power to visit Kentucky this year. Besides poverty and the necessity of attending to business, those coming events, I suspect, would be somewhat in the way. I most heartily wish you and your Fanny would not fail to come. Just let us know the time, and we will have a room provided for you at our house, and all be merry together for a while. Be sure to give my respects to your mother and family. Assure her that if I ever come near her I will not fail to call and see her. Mary joins in sending love to your Fanny and to you. Yours as ever, A. Lincoln. After the race, still smarting from the mortification of defeat and the disappointment of a cherished hope, he took his old friend Jim Matheny away off to a solitary place in the woods, and then and there, with great emphasis, protested that he had not grown proud and was not an aristocrat. "Jim," said he in conclusion, "I am now, and always shall be, the same Abe Lincoln that I always was." End of Section 16.